Craanford village in County Wexford is located 4 miles from Gorey. The village is located off the Cornew Road. The corn mill is on the right hand side of the road going into the village. The River Lask flows under the bridge leading to the village. The mill is a 17th century water mill. The water to drive the mill was taken from the River Lask about a mile upstream, and it flowed through a mill race to a mill pond beside the mill. After passing over the water wheel, the water flowed in a tail race to rejoin the River Lask. This sketch shows a mill with an overshot water wheel. The weir on the river diverts the water to the mill race and the mill pond. From the mill pond, the water is fed to the water wheel through a sluice. It then flows through a tail race back to the river. Michael Lyons started working in the mill in 1931 at 6 years of age. The mill became derelict after its closure in 1948. It was lovingly restored to full working order by Michael in the mid-1990s. As Michael says, every village in Ireland has a mill to feed you, a school to educate you and to know right from wrong, and a church to give thanks to a God. This is Michael's story of Craanford Corn Mill.
I'm Michael Lyons of Craanford Mill here. And Craanford Mill is here a lot longer than me. It was set up here, as far as research can tell us, in the 1600s. 1610 is the actual year that this mill opened here in Craanford. My grandfather came here in 1820 as a miller, and he worked this. Previous to that, there was a man by the name of Inman owned it, and he had a couple of mills in the area, and he had no family, so his business died out. Before him was a man by the name of Byrne owned it, and that was there was only that many number of millers. There was Byrne first, then Inman. His people was from Wales across the water, and then my grandfather take over. And my grandfather's son was also a miller, and it was from him I learned the trade. And I milled here, as I have told you, until 1948, when the coming of the electricity done away with this type of enterprise in the speed and the cleanliness and the efficiency of the electric driven mills that became available at that particular time. Now it's a mill driven by water. That's what they call a Roman overshot water wheel driving the machinery here behind me in this mill. And that type of machinery was not available 400 years ago. So therefore, before the first 200 years of this in operation here would be wooden wheels. You can still see some behind me here, some of the wheels still made of wood. And that's very interesting, because that determines the age of a mill. If there's anyone trying to fool you, look at the end wall of a mill, and the end wall of a mill is, if there's plaster in it, it's only about 200 years old. If there's no plaster in it, it can be up to 700 or 800 years old, because plaster only come in the building a mill is about 200 years ago. And that's one way to have of finding out how ancient the mill is. Now this mill served the needs of this district up until 1948. It closed down then as a business entity because we weren't able to compete with the electric powered mills that had came on the market at that particular time. In other words, the coming of electricity to the rural areas closed down a lot of little industries, just like the mill, just like the forges, the blacksmiths where they worked, and we just couldn't compete. The difference was here in the milling point of view was the farmers would bring their corn here and they leave it in for the big ground. And I would tell them as a miller here to come back in a week. You wouldn't be ready for a week because there'd be others in before you. You see, there's nothing you could do about that. Everybody got their turn. But when the electric mills came to the countryside, and some people had them privately owned, but there was some working for hire as well. But you went to where one of these mills were working, and they had an output now of about 5 or 6 tons of meal per hour, the electric driven mills. The little machine here behind me, driven by the water, had an output of only half a ton per hour at its best. So it was quite obvious that this couldn't last. So the people went to where they got the quick service. No but double journey, yoked up your horse and brought the corn there and waited for 5 or 10 minutes and the corn was ground and you took it back with you. So that was why these mills closed, and they all closed around the same particular time. In that 5 or 6 year period, like from the late 40s into the mid 50s, mills disappeared off the land, you know, very, very quickly. The milling industry itself, of course, is the oldest in the world. You can trace milling back in Africa to about 12,000 years ago. This implement that I have here beside me is what they call a mortar and pestle. This is of African origin, and that's a genuine one from Africa. Now, I'm not able to tell you the type of wood it is made from, but it's practically everlasting, to tell me. Now, it was a friend of mine that was a teacher. He was teaching English language to some of the African people, and he brought it over to me. I said I should have one here because it's the origin start of milling, and I'm thankful to him for doing so. Now, how it worked was this. You were here and you put your grain, it was nuts off of trees that would be using at that time, and you pound it like this. And while you're doing so, you're doing a bit of a chant. You don't stand here like me saying nothing. You just chant around and you keep time with that. And when I do my little bit, I pass it on to my neighbour, and he's standing here, and another man standing there, and another man there, another, maybe 5 or 6 around this in any of the homes where they'll be doing this. And every one of them done a bit of a chant, passed a stick around, and said a prayer at the end of it. Now, this was demonstrated to me here by 6 African people that was here a couple of years ago one summer, and I was asking them, their eyes lit up when they seen that. They thought they were back home. It was a wonderful thing to have in a place when they were on holiday. So they explained how it was done to me, and that's how I know. And they done the chant, and they done a bit of a dance around it. You know, they kept going and leaping around it and singing, and they sort of frightened me. But they were doing it in their own dialogue, their own language, and I hadn't a clue, of course, what they were saying. And I said to him afterwards, "What's the meaning of this? Why don't you pound and make your meal?" "Oh," he says, "we're giving thanks to a God." We progressed slowly down through the years. That got too slow a way doing it as the population increased, and they had to find another way, and the other way was stone. This was the mortar and pestle system here. That got too slow, as I was saying, and then they had to use a stone. And when they started using stone, this was the type of stone they would be using. In fact, what they did, they used whatever stone was in the area where the food was. Don't remember now, we're not farming yet. We are following the work of nature, the course of nature. We were going to where there was wild food growing in the form of berries, nuts and fruits and various things, and eating them the way they were. We weren't manufacturing in any form whatsoever. But now, as we were getting a little bit cleverer and we were getting a better diet, because it was being the grinding of the corn or the cereal, or whatever you like to call it, releases the value of the food in the form of different minerals and different vitamins, things that's not available to the human system or to the body in the ordinary course of eating them whole without manufacturing. So the beginning of manufacture would be about 10,000 years ago when they started doing this. So that's a little story now that's not generally known, but it is important to realise that our ancestors would be living wild. It would be primitive man, but still we were working. We were getting the heads to work. From that to that was a big step. This produced twice the rate using stone, twice the rate of what the wood was doing. So therefore, it meant an awful difference. But there was a little problem with that. It wasn't a little problem; it was quite a big problem. And it was the Egyptians discovered it and cured it. As you know, milling came from Africa into Egypt and then into Europe. But the Egyptians was quite clever, and they invented the wheel, they invented this type of stone, they invented a whole lot of things. But when I say invented this type of stone, what I mean was in the area wherever the food was, they were using whatever sort of stone was available to them. And that was how important the different stones were. Now, they noticed, you see, that some of the areas the people were dying at a young age. As people advanced, it's very hard to get the picture of this across, that how primitive and how slow moving we were at that time. But they did notice there were certain people dying at a young age, and they couldn't understand why it wasn't happening everywhere. As I said, you're moving, you're following the wild food that's growing, because we're not yet farming. And the Egyptians began looking at this, and they said there must be something wrong. So they discovered, after a lot of trial and error, that what was wrong was the stone they were using was toxic. And when you're grinding with a stone, you're going to be shedding some of the grit and sand off of that stone, and it's going to get into your food chain, and you're going to eat it. And you'll digest it all right, but it'll accumulate in the liver, and that's where the deaths came in. Now this is authentic, because there was a doctor here a few years ago, and I was telling this story just the same as I'm telling you, and he says that's exactly right. And he explained to the rest of the audience that was here at that time what was happening, the way it worked inside in the digestive system, and how it caused the early deaths. They were searching from then on for a better stone that didn't have these toxins. They wouldn't know anything about poisons or toxins at the time, but they knew that stone was dangerous and that one wasn't. And they found that stone in France about 2,000 years, or maybe it might be 2,500 years ago. And that particular stone is called French burr. And the French burr stone doesn't shed any sand or grit, so therefore you're safe enough. Anyway, it's not a toxin. You can eat it if you were able, but it's quite hard. Wouldn't be very nice. We paddled on that way for years and years and years, just with a slow system like that, until around about maybe 3,000 years ago we started looking for power. And the first power we had was what we called horizontal power, just a few bits of twigs, timber left down on the river, and the motion of the water flowing by gave the power. It got the wheel turning, or it wasn't the wheel, it was just branches of trees tied to a pole that they stuck down in the ground. That's the beginning of power, again Egyptian. Now that worked for a while. Then we had what we call the paddle wheel. Now we've seen, if any of you are old enough to have seen old films, you'll see steam ships driven up the rivers in America with the paddle wheel. And that paddle wheel is Egyptian too, it was invented that way. But the paddle wheel they used the full width of the stream that we're using and got a good force of water. It was a lot better than the horizontal wheel, but still very weak, in comparison to what was to follow. What was to follow was what the Greeks come along. The Greeks were very clever people, and they made a very large wheel with tremendous power, but the problem with that Greek wheel was it only worked on large rivers. It used a big volume of water, whereas the next wheel that was to come after that, the Roman wheel, was using a very small amount of water. What happened was the Greeks was using volume and the Romans were using weight. And that made all the difference. Now the volume of water, you only get it on large rivers, you see, for to turn the wheel. Now the Romans made a wheel that contained the water. It trapped the water within the wheel itself. There's little pockets or containers on the wheel, and they fill up with water. Now, and when we're starting this one going now in a couple of minutes, you'll have to wait a few minutes till the wheel fills up with water, and then it'll start going. But now, once it starts going, the revolutions of the wheel is going slow enough that you'll only fill one of the containers at the top as the one at the bottom empties. And when the one at the bottom is empty, the other one is full at the top. So you have the same weight of water in the wheel pulling it around all the time, but you only need a small amount of water to fill the first container. So that was a wonderful breakthrough. It meant that you could use any little mountain stream anywhere around for to drive one of these wheels. All you needed was a stock pond behind it to put a little bit of pressure on the water, and you had tremendous power without a big volume of water. So from then on, that would be around maybe don't quote me too hard on the dates, because I'd have to say circa around 2,500 years ago. And when that happened, mills got very plentiful all over Europe, and from then on until the coming of the steam age, that was the way to go. The Roman wheel, the Roman overshot water wheel, became the Rolls Royce of mill wheels at that particular time. At the end of that period, we invented steam, and we invented a whole lot of things then when we got in a hurry. And the inventing of the steam meant a revolution in every manufacturing industry in the world. Strange to say, for thousands of years, the only power mankind would have had would be either wind or water. And we were depending on that for everything. And of course there was animal power and various other things, but the main powers would be wind and water at that particular time. At the end of that period, when steam was invented, about 300 years ago only, we come up with the steam power, the electric power, all invented in less than 100 years. Thousands of years, no, just nothing, only wind or water. Any manufacturing was done that way. And then we got in a hurry and we used the modern technology that we have today. So the earlier part of our living was slow moving, but very clever and very indigenous. They used whatever materials they had, and they were quite happy in doing so. I'd be talking to the fella on the car, and I had this, like talking about the match yesterday, and who hurled well and who played bad, and that shouldn't have been a goal, and the referee was getting the work too. So we'd come on with the bag at the same time. I'd be talking away the same as I am now, and I would go over here to the scales, put the sack on it, weigh it, and register in the desk there in a mill book what it was, like what it was to be manufactured from oats or barley or wheat or a mixture of all three, going for animal feed or making of flour or the making of oatmeal. That was all written. Whatever you wanted done with the grain was written down in the book, and you'd be told to come back in about a week or 10 days when the corn would be ready. It's a very complicated job making oatmeal. It has to go through the mill 3 times. It has to be dried in a certain way to get the maximum amount of meal out of the hull. So it's a bit of a specialised job making the oatmeal. Then for animal feed, then maybe Peter, somebody else's name and a different number, and maybe for animal feed it would be a mixture of all the grains for animal feed, and that's usually the turnover, and that would be about a week. You came to this day, come back this day week for it. The oatmeal one would be about 2 weeks, and the bread one is a little over a week. It depended on how eager the people were for to get the bread. Like, you know, the conditions in the countryside at that time would be very different to what it is today. But some people would be really waiting for it. You know, that was important that you had it ready for them when they came. We'll start with oats. Oats is chiefly for the manufacture of oatmeal for human consumption. It was usually white oats they used. There is 2 breeds of oats. There's a black and a white oat. It would be high quality, the best quality oat they could get for the manufacture of oatmeal. It's the most nutritious grain on the planet, oat. It's very important. So if you were being sent to a desert island, bring oat with you, you'll be okay. Now, usually the grain is a choice grain to get for the manufacture of oatmeal. So that is what it's like now. That's a close-up of the grain. So in the manufacture of that, you see the little tail, the pointy part of that. When the mill starts turning or the stone starts turning, they'll stand up vertical like a toy soldier, and the stone will crush it. That's why they're shaped that way. That's why where you get the oatmeal from, is when it's crushed. You don't actually grind it or crush it. You shell it. You take the shell off, and you let it down through a screen, and you go through the process about 3 times. And that's where the saying came from, you've been through the mill, because the grains are of different size, so you have to bring the stone down to catch the different size grains in the manufacture of oatmeal. So it's a fairly slow operation and very, very exacting. Barley is a very important crop. Of course, I hadn't said all grains is derived from that plant, which we call wild oat. I don't know the technical name for it, but barley would be one of the first ones that evolved from it before wheat. You might read in biblical times about the barley bread and barley being used for to convert sinners, if you like, by feeding them. It's chiefly used for animal feed. Barley is a sort of a knob-long grain. It's not round or not the same sort of a feature as wheat. That's the barley grains now, and that would be used for the manufacture of malt for the drinking industry. Now we come to the wheat. The wheat is for the manufacture of flour. It's derived from, it was barley before it was wheat, like in the breeding process. But there's different types of wheat for the different coking facilities that we're using today. There's what they call drum wheats, and them are used for the manufacture of pizzas and that sort of coking. The general run of the wheat that we will be using is used for the manufacture of flour for bread making, and it's growing all over the world in all the different climates. It's a very adaptable plant, and it's very prolific. It yields good crops. Of course, it has its enemies in the form of insects and things, but they're taken care of now with modern farming, with the trends with sprays and different ways of cultivating it. There's a tendency now away from them to use more organically grown crops. We're a long ways from being satisfied or fulfilled with that yet, but we're on the way. The time will come when we won't be using sprays and we won't be using a lot of fertilizers and all that, as technology improves in the breeding of the grain to utilise the nutrients that is in the soil to give us the food we want. So the shortest possible cut, we shouldn't be using any of these, we should eat the soil. But that's not possible yet, but it's coming. I suppose you could call this the most important crop because it feeds after rice, it's the most used grain in the world. There's what it's like. It's full of protein, a lot of carbohydrate in it too. It's an easily grown crop, especially nowadays with modern tillage and the way it's been done. But it's a very, very exacting crop. Now, there are a lot of different varieties, and the different varieties is that they're giving, for the different products, they're using different types of wheat to make a larger volume of the end product, whatever it would be. So there's a lot of work going on in the breeding of wheat, but that's what it's like. That's the grain of wheat now. If you notice, it's not as pointy as the barley or the oat, but it's a round buff end on them, and the outer shell of that is also a very valuable product. We call it bran. The function of the kilning is to dry the corn, actually prepare it for grinding. What you're doing with the corn is conditioning it now, rather, it's a better word than drying it, conditioning the corn to get it into a state where the maximum amount of flour will leave that grain and come to the process of milling. Why it's dried in the first place, we live in a sort of a damp climate here in Ireland. And usually the moisture content of the corn is too low. It'll squeeze together or crush rather than grind. So you have to dry it into a sort of a semi-liquid before you grind it. You can't over dry it either. So this is the skill of a miller, and that's why that place there behind me, the kiln, is the most important room in the mill. You had to have a skill by the touch and feel of grain to know how many hours it will be left over that fire on a brick type floor, a floor made up of a brick type material, for to get it into a condition that you get the maximum amount of flour out of a particular grain. Now, all grain is not the same because it's growing on different farms and different soils. It's managed in different ways by different farmers, and some people will be lucky and happen on good weather and some people will not. So the variation in the grain that's coming in here to the miller has to be got in a way that I'll know how many hours to leave your grain over that fire. If not, I won't get the maximum amount of flour of it, and the quality of the flour will not be as good. That was what a miller did. That's why you're a miller. And now in the state of the corn that comes in, it's not in good order, no matter how well I dry it or how I do it, I will not get the maximum amount of flour out of it. A certain amount will adhere or stick to the outer shell of the grain. And there's nothing I can do about it, but some people will be worrying then when they're taking home the corn, if they happen to be going together, maybe one person will be getting maybe 90% of flour back out of a given quantity, and the other one might be only getting 45 or 50 or 55% out of it. And the reason is that it won't leave the shell if it's not in condition. When you bring in the corn, because everybody's corn is going to be that little bit different, it has been grown on different soils, it has been managed in different ways, and some people will have good weather at it and some people will have bad. But everybody wants to get good flour, and that's my job, to give people the good flour. And the first thing I do when that sack of corn comes in, I put my hand into it like that, and I shove it down in as far as I can, like easy, without much pressure. And the distance my arm goes down into that tells me the number of hours that grain will be on the kiln to get it into a condition that will make the proper sort of flour or the proper oatmeal or the proper animal feed. If it only goes to the wrist, it means it's going to take a good bit of drying. So it will roughly take about 12 hours if it goes to the wrist. If it goes to the elbow, it'll only take about 6 hours or 7 if it goes to the elbow. That's the barometer, your arm, the condition the grain was in. What you're looking for is the wax coating that is on the grain. There's a wax coating on all grain and all plants. And the more wax there's on it during the growing season, the better the quality of the grain inside that. It's better preserved, it's saved from the elements. So if there's a good deal of wax on it, it'll be slippy and your hand will go down further. So therefore it'll be in good condition, it'll take less time to dry. If there's not a good wax coating on it and it hasn't met the right sort of weather and the right soil conditions, it's going to be tougher and it's going to take a lot harder. But again, you will not be able to get the maximum amount of flour from the grain. This is the area, the kiln, they call it, K-I-L-N, not K-I-L-I-N-G. K-I-L-N, the kiln for drying the corn. The preparation of the grain is vital to get the right sort of product, the end product. This is the most important part of the whole operation here. This is what made a miller a miller. If he could control the heat here and know exactly when to take the grain off, that it was in the perfect condition for grinding, particularly for making the flour, for the wheaten bread and the flour, that one. So there'd be a fire burning there all the time, 365 days of the year, and it would be burning in the old days it would be burning wood and peat or turf. In my time here, whenever we were into the modern age, we were using anthracite. The anthracite came from Castlecomer in County Kilkenny, brought here by horse and cart, which is over 50 miles of a run. One man with 2 horses and carts had come down here. He'd unload it, he'd stop overnight here and he'd go back the next day back to Kilkenny with his empty cart, and he had £4 for doing so. Heat rises, so there's a big fire burning here, but over that fire, the floor up over that fire is made up of this material. Large holes on one side, that is to capture the maximum amount of heat. Small holes on the top, so the air will filter up, the warm air, through the small hole. The grain is here about 3 or 4 inches deep, so it'll go up through the corn, the warm air. Now, how does the miller know how long has to be left there? If you come in here now as a raw recruit, you could easily spoil a whole batch of grain on the kiln. But how he knew was, he had tested it, as I've previously showed you, with his arm, the distance that your arm goes down in the sack of grain tells him the moisture content of it, how long it has to be on this kiln in preparation. So he must take it off. If he doesn't get it off at the right time, this is what happens here. This is the dough going into your oven. Now in the cooking process is a chemical reaction to the heat. This is where gluten is formed, and gluten is vital in the manufacture of bread because it's the rising agent in the bread. Gluten is a rubber-like substance, and when you heat it, it expands and it will rise and bring the flour with it, and you'll finish up with a loaf of bread, something like that there, full of air marks. Good, lovely, fluffy bread, grand, velvety. Now, if the miller has made a mistake in the drying of the corn, when this gluten comes to do its work, it will be too thin and it will perforate. Little holes will come in it, the air will escape, and your bread remains flat. It won't rise, it'll matter what ingredients it rises and creams you put into it, it will not rise if you haven't the gluten there to hold the air until it's baked. And what happens when these little marks come in your loaf of bread is the bubble has burst now at the right point, and it doesn't matter, the bread is up so the gluten is escaping. It's gone, the air is escaping out of it at this stage. So you end up with a fine loaf of bread, but it will not rise if this gluten is not right in this instance. This is the crucial point of milling. Getting that right brought people here, took people away from you, because the neighbours would be here in the mill and be getting flour and going off home together, and they'd be meeting the next day talking across the fence. How did your bread turn out? Oh, it was a disaster, it didn't rise at all. Oh God, mine was perfect. Then what was wrong? So I lost that customer's business if the flour wasn't right. That's how important it was. The biggest problem in the mill in the old days was getting the grain, the raw material, up to the hopper loft. It had to be manually done, carried on your back, up ladders. But about 100 years ago, they discovered a way of getting the water to do it. So there's a shaft coming up from the wheel, the wallow wheel below, the little 2-inch shaft there between us and the windy. And if the mill is going, that's turning. And if that's turning, it's moving a winch upstairs. Now you see the winch now, I'll put it going for you in a minute. You pull the rope and you engage a belt like that. You just tighten the belt. And when you tighten the belt, it puts a winch in motion. The chain starts rolling around and elevate your corn up to where you want it without any effort at all whatsoever. And that chain, incidentally, is long enough to reach any part of the mill. So you can take the grain from the scales inside on that simply by pulling that rope. That rope went down through this hole here as well. So you controlled it from downstairs. So that was a very important invention. It took the hard work out of me. There was no more running up ladders with sacks of grain on your back when that was discovered. So that was a big breakthrough. It depended on what you were doing with it. If it was flour and wheat, you put it over there to the left-hand side. There's a box there called a hopper. You fill the hopper, it'll hold about 10 bags of wheat. The one there, you can see a heap of bags on it at the moment. That would be for animal feed. That's a box too. It's a cone-shaped box that'll work by gravity. And the one here on the right-hand side would be the very same. You put the good oats for the oatmeal into that hopper. And it was all gravity. If you just take note of the stone in the middle there, the stone in the middle is what it would be like. All the 3 stones would be dressed exactly like that. They'd all have that same apparatus in the centre, taking the grain down to them in the centre. The wheat one would have the same, and the oatmeal one would be the very same. If you come in and them covered, you wouldn't know which was which because they all look identical. Only the miller would know which stone was which for grinding. Into the hopper loft is poured into a box called a hopper. It'll come down through that sacking there into the pan here. This is called a pan. That is shaking and moving like that. And here, that's the way it will be going all the time. And into the millstone. That's the purpose of that there. All 3 stones would have that. The principle is the very same. Get it up into the hopper, down by gravity, into this part of it, and into each of the stones individually had this apparatus on them. You control the flow of the grain by what they call a turn peg. The turn peg there, you move this in accordance with the flow of the grain because different grain will flow at different rates. Now, for instance, wheat would flow a lot quicker than barley. Barley would flow a lot quicker than oats. So you had to know that, and you control the flow with that, what they call the turn peg there. That raised or lowered this hopper here to let the flow of grain into the centre of the stone. Yeah, the drive has consisted of this. The big mill wheel outside is turning, driven by the water. It drives this wheel that I'm pointing to here now. That's called a pit wheel. The pit wheel drives this crown wheel here. The crown wheel is much smaller. It's also fixed to the same axle as the wallower on. And the wallower fits what we call the head wheel here. The head wheel drives the millstone overhead. Now, to change gear from one to the other, from say making oatmeal to making animal feed, you would have to, you'd stop the mill, number one, make it motionless. You'd screw down these screws here that I'm pointing to now to mesh with the wallower wheel here. That has to, that's called the head wheel. That has to fit into that wheel. Now there's another one engaged that you were grinding previously, so you have to screw it in the opposite direction, move it up out of mesh with this one here. And it took about an hour almost to do that, so it was a very slow operation. So you usually did animal feed one day and flour for human use another day and oatmeal another day, rather than be wasting time changing gear every few minutes. Now, how they moved, the fineness of grinding is determined. It might be better out here now. This is called a bridge. If you note there, the slats here in the supports of that bridge. So there's a mechanism here for screwing it up and down. That determines the fineness of grinding. You let the whole stone, or the stone, be about 2 tons weight. So you're able to move that 2 tons on that thing there, just by turning that up or down to catch the real fineness of grinding. It was an exacting job, because when you start grinding, you would feel the finished product coming out, and you rub it between your finger and your thumb. And if it was too much grit in it, you had to make an adjustment down here to let the stone up or down that little bit to catch the right consistency of the product that you were using, whether it be flour or whatever it was, animal feed or whatever. This is the stone for the manufacture of flour. It's a stone called French burr. It comes from France naturally, and it was discovered about 2,000 years ago. And from then on, that was the only stone would be used for the manufacture of flour for bread making or human consumption. The reason being, it's so hard, it doesn't shed itself. It doesn't shed sand or grit like all the other previous stones that they were using did. You got the pure product out of this, so therefore it was used all over Europe. Now, it consists of 2 stones. Underneath here at the bottom here, I'll just move it a little bit to let you see. The bedstone, it doesn't move at all. But the upper or runner stone, what's called the runner stone, it does the grinding. It goes around grinding the corn. The one underneath called the bedstone, it holds the corn. It's dressed in such a way, by dressed I mean there's little grooves cut in it that holds the grain until it's fine enough to fall out of it. And it falls out then, and it's brought around by the circular motion or centrifugal action of the stone. It's inside the frame there, as you can see, like this one here. And it's the friction will bring the meal around with it to an opening point in the floor, which you demonstrated there by that white lid. It'll fall down there onto the previous thing I was showing you downstairs, the screening, where the screening is done. And as I said, the different screens will give you the different product. So that's the reasonable explanation of the wheaten stone for the grinding of the flour. It was a very expensive stone always, because it had to come from France, and we hadn't very modern ways of transport back a few 100 years ago. But that was the way it was. But you'll find a French burr stone in every mill that's grinding for human consumption all over Europe and all over the British Isles, just the same as that one there. This stone that I'm looking and pointing to now is for the manufacture of animal feed. It's a mixture of granite and flint, manufactured in England as a manufactured stone. It would have a short life in comparison to the French one there that I have previously described, in as much as this would last about 50 years grinding. The other one would last for at least 150 years. Now this one only did animal feed, and as it was working for animals, it would be more in use than any of the other stones that's here. The reason being there's more animals to be fed, so there's more stuff to go through. Usually it was a mixture of wheat, oats and barley. Mostly particularly in the wartime, you wouldn't be allowed to use wheat for animal feed, and it'd be only barley and oats they would be using for feeding the animals. But previous to that, before the wars, if you had wheat, it embellished it. It made it a lot more higher in protein and a more valuable food, so they put in a bit of wheat in the manufacture. As I said, the life of that would be around 50 years, and there was you could manufacture it yourself, or you could reline it yourself. There was a compound came to resurface the stone and put it in a way that had grind for another 50 years, that particular stone. Now the one here, the most important one of all, or the most intriguing, called an oatmeal stone. Now an oatmeal stone is vastly different from the previous two I have been describing. This particular one that I'm here with is from County Cavan, that were got up there. They're also found here in Wexford down at Hookhead, but they weren't available at the time this was discovered. They hadn't discovered the ones in Wexford. But the dressing of the stone, I was just mentioned it there in the previous one, there's little grooves cut in the bottom of the bedstone to hold the grain until it's ground. In this case, it's not. The pick, there's a steel pick for dressing the stone, and it has a sort of an X shape on the point of the pick, so it cuts a little hole in the stone, just a little tiny hole. But you ever see the way a bird picks an apple? There'll be little holes like that in the stone. Now when you start the stone in motion, you have it raised up a certain height off of the bedstone. When it puts it in motion, the little grains of oat stand up like little Thai soldiers in these little holes, and the upper stone is just brushing the top of them, and you let it down the slightest point, and it'll shell the larger grains. When the motion starts, the movement of the upper stone just moves the grain, but they'll fall into these little niches, these little X's that's inside in it, and they'll stand up there. You bring down the runner stone just close enough for to just brush the tops of the oat, the tail of the oat, and it will shell. Then it goes down through a cleaning process, down through a set of riddles, and it's into a bag down below, and you take it back up again and you put it through it again, and the same thing happens. Now you bring the stone down another little bit this time, and you do it the third time, and you get all the smaller grains. Then you say the grains will not be the same size, they'll be different lengths. Nowadays, of course, that's all gone. They grade the grain before they make the oatmeal, and it's one process does it. But that's where the saying came from, you've been through the mill. When you're manufacturing oatmeal, the man down at the bottom would be asking, is this lot through yet, number 3 or whatever number it was? No, that has been through the mill. That's where that saying came from, you've been through the mill. So that's how the oatmeal is a very special type of stone, and it's dressed, as I said, different from all the others for the manufacture of oatmeal. It was a very exacting job making oatmeal, particularly the drying of it had to be got to a certain temperature, and it had crack easily without damaging the kernel, the meal part of it itself. There was a byproduct off of it too, what they called gold dust. You'd find it in the space between the hull of the oat and the kernel, the grain, and that was used in olden times for medicinal purposes by our local country doctors, which we call quacks nowadays, and vets. They'd be looking for this dust to make ointments and to make cures for all the animals in the early days. And by early days of milling here, they'd be asking me, when are you making oatmeal? Will you keep me a peck of that little dust? Now this is for the manufacture of flour. The flour stone is overhead. The screen is here. It comes down in a full raw product here on that. It's ground, of course, but it's of different consistencies. It'll go through the screen, the fine flour, and it'll come down into a bag there on the left-hand side. What remains on top of the screen, and there's any foreign matter that is in the grain, like, and as well as the hull of the grain, that remains on top, and that'll come into the bag here on the right. It wouldn't be wasted. That goes for animal feed, and this is the flour here on the left-hand side. That'll be shaking like that all the time during the grinding there. It's just the same as you're riddling sand or anything like that. So that determined the fineness of your grinding. You had 3 screens, you had 3 choices. You tell the miller you wanted it fine, medium or coarse, and he'd put in the relevant screen for you to manufacture your flour. Behind me here where the fire is burning, that would be the hub of any community around the kiln fire. The whole business of the area would be done from there, because there was no other way of doing it. There was no way of getting in contact with the people, only the people that came here. And this would be the centre, and the central figure in that would be what we called a journeyman. And a journeyman was a man travelling the country, doing a trade. He might be a thatcher, thatching a house. He might be a carpenter, you know, making a door or a gate or something. He might be a stone mason building walls. It could be any trade, a basket maker or whatever. But he came to the mill in every district he went through. And the reason he came to the mill was the miller knew where the work was. Because you were here during the day, and you're going to be telling me the rain came in last night, you want somebody to thatch the house. Somebody else's door blew off, he wants a carpenter. Somebody else wants a ditch built. They'll all have come here with their car, and they'll be talking to me in the course of ordinary conversation and tell me what happened. This man, this journeyman will come in here too, and he'll ask me where is the work. And I'll tell him to go to so and so and so and so. And he'll get the work, but he'll come back here, invariably he'll come back here every evening. He'll sit around that fire and he'll start singing songs. And he'll also start telling us the stories that he has picked up in the last place he was. He might be thatching a house maybe 20 mile away. He might be building a ditch 20 mile. A different story man I'm talking about, not the one man that's not doing all. But there'll be 5 or 6 story men here, or journalists here, any night during the week that have come from other places, that stay overnight and then move on to another place. But that was the only way of getting news around. There wasn't any other system. So that came from in the early days of civilization. And if you notice, you see it all over the place. People lived in circles. You often heard of circling the wagon. And circling the wagon is defence. And that went on back through the years. And the defence in that days, apart from the human aggression, would be the animals. The wild animals was in the country. So they had to be fenced out. And you see, everybody set up their little huts and their defences in circles all over the place. The journeyman came from that. The only people that moved into them circles or into them places would be a journeyman, because we wouldn't know what their culture was. Now, they might be only a mile away or 2 mile away, but there'd be a different leader, a different captain, or whatever you'd like to call it, of that tribe. We went around in tribes, and the journeyman was the man who mixed through all the tribes, and he brought the news everywhere. And that was the only way we got news until the coming of the modern media. A mill was a wonderful place to work. It was great. You were meeting people at the door in a time when there would be very little communications in the media. We wouldn't have radios now in my early days here. No, we wouldn't have bicycles. You'd have a motor car like it'd be from outer space if one came to the area. But we managed, and we come here and we met each other and we talked to each other. And around the fire, there's a fire burning here behind. This was where storytelling began, around the kiln fire at night. Music, song and dance took place in there. And that's how our culture spread. Now, if you think of it, there was no other way of spreading it, only that. There wouldn't be any modern communications, there wouldn't be newspapers. Now, for instance, one thing I'll tell you here now. My grandfather here told me that the first newspaper read in this area in Craanford was read here in the mill, because a lot of people didn't know how to read. There was a school teacher teaching school up at the top of the village here. My grandfather got him down to read this newspaper that people never had seen or heard of. Now, we couldn't have newspapers in places like this until the coming of the railways. So what I'm telling you is the whole chain of events adds up. The coming of the railways brought commerce, trading between the cities and the country towns. Now, when how the newspaper come into it, you see, once the train was coming from Dublin down to Wexford and Enniscorthy and these local places, the newspapers was put on, so they were distributed. And they came here, so naturally my grandfather bought one. But he was getting the teacher to read what was happening in Europe in World War I at that time, whose brothers and sisters was there listening to him around that fire that hadn't yet joined the army, that hadn't went away. So that was the sad part of it, like, you know, what it was doing is letting people see what a war was really like when there was maps and illustrations on the papers of what was actually happening in France, and giving it through the media. And we here for the first time, remember, now we hadn't, you know, it's hard to believe it, that there was a time when we hadn't any of the things. And today now I can press a button here and I'll be in touch with Rome or Moscow or Japan or anything in a millisecond. So that's the difference. That's the change in the world that has come to place. And the people are coping with it. Like, it's wonderful when you think of it. We're also important in this way that landlords back in more recent times were in control of all the mills. I'd be here grinding corn, and I'd be written in a book there what you got done during the year, and you paid once a year for your corn. But for some reason I didn't like the miller here, and I went to another miller who was down the road a bit farther away. He was better at doing his job, and I took my business away from this mill and went to this other mill. That was all right, you see, it was only millers, men working in it, like it didn't matter. But now the landlords got very clever, and what they done, they get the mill book from this mill, swap, look up, see your name, wondering why didn't you get your corn ground with me? And you would say, well, sure, the other miller was turning out that the product was better stuff. Oh, that's fine, that's all right. He says, but will you get a bit of land from that man next year for to feed your children and sow your potatoes and sow your grain? He was in control. Now, the people had these in the houses, and he sent his henchmen around to the houses. They broke them, and that's why you'll find the broken quern. That's the story of the quern.